At the end of the Second World War, there were nearly 300,000 British and American prisoners of war in Germany, and my grandfather Russ was one of them. I first read his war diary 2 years ago, and ever since then I've been obsessed with his story, working on all the details I could uncover about his experiences. This has taken me on a personal and physical journey. I've been to the archives in the UK, and I've been to Germany to visit an old factory in which he lived and worked. This journey has been built on the support of my family and connections with people. One of the most important connections I made was with a man by the name of Helmut. He had been a child of 9 or 10 years old during the war, living at the factory with his family. He has an exceptional memory and remembers the prisoners. He even formed a friendship with one of them. He later became the town archivist, and so has been a fantastic resource for me. After corresponding for some time, I decided to go to Germany and meet him, and to see this factory for myself. So I went there in September last year with my husband Pete, and everybody got involved, including our Airbnb hosts and a friend of theirs who came to do translation for us. Through Helmut, we learned about the history of the factory. It had been a cardboard production factory, standing unused since the flood in the 1920s. Then late in the war, the Germans were bringing these country factories back into production for the war effort. And that's how my grandfather came to be there. So it's ironic that both he and I arrived at a derelict factory only 75 years apart. The prisoners of war were needed to help get this factory back up on its feet by renovating the building itself. It's on a lonely road in an isolated place surrounded by forest. The 40 prisoners of war who came to work on it consisted of 10 South Africans and 30 British. They'd all been captured in North Africa some time before and had been prisoners in Italy, then transferred to Germany. They were between the ages of 20 and 35 and came from all walks of life. Although this wasn't a conventional camp with barbed wire, it was a small camp, and the prisoners were held behind this locked door. They were accompanied everywhere in their work by the guards, and there was a fair amount of tension between the prisoners and the guards, as recorded in my grandfather's diary. This is what's left now of the camp area behind that door. This is where the prisoners had their beds, their mess tables, where the kitchen was, etc. They did all their own cooking and cleaning because it was such a small camp, and this is where they lived, shoulder to shoulder in close confines for over a year. These are the photos that my grandfather pinned up on his camp bed in that camp. My mother was born while he was away, as he had married my grandmother just before the war. She would be 4 years old before he met her, and my grandfather clung to these connections with home. They had a civilian boss, a man by the name of Mr. Hans Sheeran, and by all accounts had a good relationship with him. He was a fair man and was often kind to them. He lived in a house at the factory, and so the prisoners were exposed to the ordinary family life of German people going on around them. This is what much of the factory looks like now, and I believe this was what my grandfather refers to as the machine room. The prisoners were used for general labor in the factory, largely for the renovation of the building itself. It was paid work, and it was pretty boring and pretty hard at times. Another area of work was establishing this food garden alongside the factory. Food self-sufficiency was very important during the war. My grandfather writes about building a well, and it was amazing for us to go there last year and to find that this very well is still there and still functioning. The prisoners survived on small rations, but largely on the support of the Red Cross organization. There's constant speculation in my grandfather's diary about the arrival of the next Red Cross parcels, which contained food, cigarettes, and clothing. But it was a pretty grim time, and some of the worst winters in Europe were experienced during the war. My grandfather was suffering from malnutrition, as he had been a prisoner for quite some time, and he constantly had boils, flu, colds, and his teeth were in terrible condition. Medical support was very little. But despite this, the spirit of resistance was strong, and there are many handwritten accounts of the sabotage the men were getting up to in the factory that I found in the archives in the UK. And this brings me to the piece of wood. Helmut had handed me a piece of wood when we were visiting last year, and on the back of this piece of wood was written a rude message to Hitler. It had been written by a prisoner of war and then nailed up onto the wooden barrack below. It had remained hidden for 55 years and was uncovered when this barrack was demolished in the 1990s. As the war went on, the prisoners hungered for news. From time to time they could see the RAF flying overhead and hear the distant sounds of bombing in Dresden. They traded cigarettes with the German civilians for news, and it always amazes me that on the day of the Normandy landings, my grandfather wrote about it in his diary. He knew it had happened. I've only been able to relate a small part of the story tonight. There are more chapters. My grandfather went on to Dresden and was there when Dresden was bombed by the Allies. I continue my work on his story and am working towards a book. So it all started with his diary and ended, or temporarily ended, with me last year visiting the factory in Germany. The message I want to leave you with tonight, though, is it doesn't matter what you start with. Start digging for the stories behind those things, and you'll find that the stories come forward to meet you.